Salt Lake City, Utah, September 28, 2004. For most residents, it was just another quiet fall evening. But inside the small home of 72-year-old Donna Lou Bott, a nightmare was unfolding. When police arrived days later, they were met with a scene of brutality few would ever forget. Donna, a grandmother in her 70s, had been beaten, stabbed, strangled, and stomped to death. The violence was not just lethal, it was sadistic. Her body told the story of a prolonged, vicious attack. The man responsible was no stranger to law enforcement. His name was Floyd Eugene Maestas. By then, Maestas had already spent more than 30 years in and out of prison, convicted of burglary, assault, and rape. Time and time again, he was released only to return to his old ways. He had been given second chances, but each one ended in blood and violence. Donna Lou Bott was not his first victim. Decades earlier, Maestas had been linked to the savage rape and beating of another elderly woman. He was paroled reoffended and continued a cycle of crime that the justice system seemed powerless to stop. But in 2004, his crimes escalated to murder. The brutality of his attack on Donna shocked the community and reignited outrage at a system that allowed a repeat predator to walk free. Maestas left behind fingerprints, DNA, and a mountain of physical evidence that sealed his fate. In 2008, he was sentenced to die by lethal injection. This is not just the story of one murder. It's the story of a predator who terrorized women for decades, and the tragic reminder of what happens when justice fails to protect the most vulnerable. Classification: murderer. Characteristics: rape, robbery. Number of victims: 1. Date of murder: September 28, 2004. Date of birth: 1955. Victim profile: Donna Lou Bott, 72. Method of murder: stabbing with knife. Location: Salt Lake, Utah, USA. Status: sentenced to death on February 6, 2008. Maestas sentenced to die by lethal injection for 2004 murder, Thursday, Feb. 7, 2008. Convicted murderer Floyd Eugene Maestas was sentenced Wednesday to die by lethal injection, despite a flurry of last-minute efforts by defense attorneys to change the outcome of the hearing. Maestas, 52, was previously convicted by a jury of killing Donna Lou Bott, 72, after breaking into her Salt Lake home September 28, 2004, and beating, choking, stabbing, and then stomping the woman, which ruptured the aorta in her heart. Maestas has continually denied committing the crime and had no comment Wednesday. 3rd District Judge Paul Morgan imposed the death sentence to be carried out within 60 days, but then stayed the execution order because he said such sentences are automatically appealed to the Utah Supreme Court. The judge denied 2 motions by the defense team to give Maestas a new penalty phase trial for his capital murder conviction, and also to set aside the verdict of death because of what the lawyers described as Maestas's limited mental capacities and his inability to properly advise his defense attorneys. Defense attorney Denise Porter challenged the way a question from a juror had been handled. The juror had asked whether the Board of Pardons could overrule a sentence of life in prison without parole and still offer parole. However, Morgan said that motion was too late and that the jurors had been directed to examine jury instructions that spelled out which of the 2 verdicts they could render. Then defense attorney David Mack objected to the judge's ruling that Maestas had the legal right to make decisions regarding his defense. Maestas last week vehemently opposed his attorney's plans to present evidence of his hardscrabble childhood involving sexual, physical, and substance abuse. That evidence presumably would have shown some embarrassing light on Maestas' family, and he insisted he would not involve his family in the court proceedings, even if that meant that would put him at a disadvantage. Mack argued that Maestas does not have the intellectual functioning to be able to make those decisions. He said it was ironic that a room filled with highly educated people put their creative energies towards seeing that a damaged, morally disadvantaged person was sent to his death. Mack also said it was freakish that the court ordered the defense team to take orders from Maestas when he was the least capable person to understand or help with such intricate legal matters that had such high stakes. Mack said the jury ended up with an unreliable verdict, and that Maestas' Eighth Amendment rights, which forbid cruel and unusual punishment, had been violated. Prosecutor Kent Morgan disagreed with that motion and said that Maestas had received a fair trial and had the right to direct his own defense. Morgan said, "What is freakish is that someone would try to essentially get a plea bargain after a jury had gone through a trial and come up with a guilty verdict and a recommendation for the death penalty." The judge denied that motion as well. Morgan said that Maestas had been found to be mentally competent to stand trial and help in his own defense and was permitted by law to decide what evidence would be presented on his behalf. He may not have the full range of mental capabilities, but he is certainly competent to make that decision, the judge said. The judge said the defense attorneys had presented no new evidence, only an emotional appeal. Robin Crane, a friend of Maestas since junior high school, wept as she described how Maestas had given up and did not believe he could get a just trial because of the plea deals given to two co-defendants who were with him the night Bott was killed and who testified against him. "I've known him for 30 years. He's not a monster," she said. "He's a victim of his circumstances." She said he never got a chance to do well in school, was put in special classes for the less intelligent students, mainly because he spoke Spanish and has had a rough life. Crane said Maestas was guilty of a lot of bad things, smaller stuff, such as burglary, but he would not plead guilty to a crime such as murder because he didn't do it. Asked about Donna Bott's grieving family, Crane said she was sorry for their loss and hoped that the real culprit would feel guilty and come forward. "It's not likely, but we can pray for it." Some background on Maestas. October 23, 2000. Floyd Maestas' fingerprints were found in her home. His DNA was found in her body. But while Maestas may have been responsible for the stabbing, beating, raping, and strangling of 75-year-old Donna Lou Bott, it took more than one man to kill her. It took an entire system. Over the past 30 years, through at least a half-dozen similar attacks against elderly women, charging decisions, plea negotiations, and parole board determinations have ensured Maestas has never been convicted of a single violent crime. As a result, he never spent much time behind bars. The maddening story begins no later than 1974, as Bruce Hansen walked past the darkened home of the aunt who raised him. "I usually visited her on my way home, but on that night, I didn't," he says. "I still can't forgive myself for that." Inside, Maestas was beating and raping 64-year-old Donna Jensen. "The doctors had to sew one of her nipples back on, that's how bad it was," Hansen recalls. Maestas, then 17 years old. Was convicted of burglary. He was paroled after serving 18 months. 3 months after his release, he was arrested again. Geraldine Camolo still sobs when she thinks about cleaning Maestas' blood from underneath her grandmother's fingernails. She had fought so hard that all that blood was way down into the quick, Camolo recalls. Alinda Ross, Robbins McLean's nails were the least of the 79-year-old woman's concerns. Over the course of several hours on the evening of October 13, 1976, she was repeatedly raped and savagely beaten. And before Maestas left her home, he lifted a broken lamp from the floor and told the twice-widowed woman that he was going to use it to gouge out one of her eyes. And then he did just that. While she cleaned her grandmother's hands, the only thing Camolo could think to do at the moment, the old woman wondered aloud why she had been chosen for such punishment. She just kept saying over and over, "I can't understand why anyone would do this to me." There was, of course, no answer for that poor, beautiful old woman. But there was a promise that should have been made, a promise that should have been kept, a promise that wasn't. Maestas served 6 years for the attack on McLean, and he spent the following decade in and out of prison on a slew of parole violations, most of which his family members recall had something to do with elderly women. In the fall of 1989, prosecutors were eyeing Maestas in at least 3 new burglaries. In 2, the elderly victims were physically beaten and sexually assaulted. But officials chose to prosecute Maestas on a 3rd case. A burglary in which Maestas was confronted by 3 elderly Greek sisters who had come home from church together to make some baklava and chased out of their home before he could attack. Convicted of theft burglary and being a habitual criminal, Maestas was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. The other cases were set aside. One was dismissed, the other never filed. Loana Nelson, now 69 years old, is still not sure why her case was ignored. At the time, a detective showed me his rap sheet and said, "Listen, this is all this guy needs to be put away forever," Nelson says. I believed him. 9 years later, Maestas was back on the street. Once again, he repeatedly violated his parole. In April 2000, he was convicted of burglary, one of the few convictions on Maestas' lengthy criminal record that does not involve an elderly female victim, and sentenced to a 1 to 5 year prison term. He was released from prison on September 9 months before the full 5 years. And without supervision, said parole board chairman Mike Sibbett. 3 weeks later, Bott was dead. Her badly beaten body lay in the bedroom of her home for 3 days before police, acting on the concerns of neighbors, entered her home. Next to her body, they found a pair of her underwear. An autopsy determined Bott's face had been slashed while she was still alive. She was strangled and her teeth were fractured, and she had been raped. Maestas left a mountain of physical evidence in his wake. And that is all well and good for prosecutors who appear poised to seek the death penalty in Bott's murder. They're now making the promise they should have made long ago. If Maestas doesn't die of lethal injection, he'll die in prison. But it's too late for Jensen, too late for McLean, too late for Nelson. The failure to make the promise became the lifeblood of a serial rapist. And the failure to keep it resulted in the death of Donna Lou Bott. Floyd Eugene Maestas spent more than 3 decades cycling in and out of prison, leaving behind a trail of broken lives. His final crime, the brutal murder of 72-year-old Donna Lou Bott, was the darkest chapter in a life already defined by violence. In 2008, the court sentenced him to death by lethal injection, but no sentence could erase the pain endured by Donna's family or the fear his crimes left in the community. For many, his case became a chilling reminder of what happens when a repeat predator slips through the cracks of the justice system. Maestas' story forces us to ask difficult questions. How many warnings must be ignored before a tragedy like this unfolds? How do we protect the most vulnerable when monsters like him hide in plain sight? Because sometimes justice comes too late, and by then the damage can never be undone.